In the U.S., there is currently no law that regulates hate speech. Justice Samuel Alito both defined and defended hate speech for the purpose of protecting free expression. He wrote, "Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful. But the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate." John Stuart Mill, a defender of free speech, believed that ethically we should be able to openly discuss anything regardless of the morality behind it. However, he proposed one important exception to this rule, and what has come to be known as the harm principle, which states that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. But what constitutes as harm to another person? Harm can be of a physical or mental nature, although determining the effect of the latter proves more difficult. The Supreme Court has established standards to regulate speech that incites harm from the physical standpoint.
Well, through my courses, what I have found is that there is not much hate speech regulation in the United States due to our free speech amendment. And also the fact that a lot of the regulations that have been made towards free speech that doesn't involve or have anything to do with hate speech.
Okay, what do I know about hate speech regulation? I know that there's probably not too much for it because of the amendments and the amendments for free speech and freedom to say what you want and write and such. So probably not that much.
Let's begin with the case of Schenck v. United States in 1919. It was shortly after the U.S. had entered World War I, and Charles T. Schenck was a general secretary of the Socialist Party who opposed the implementation of the military draft in the country. He printed and distributed pamphlets urging men to resist the draft. He was arrested for violating the Espionage Act of 1917 and appealed on the grounds that he was simply exercising his First Amendment right to free speech. The court upheld the ruling on the grounds that Schenck's criticism of the draft was not protected under the First Amendment because it would incite a crime and create a clear and present danger to the enlistment process during a state of war. This case is significant for establishing a clear and present danger test, which allowed for the freedom of speech protection afforded in the First Amendment to be restricted if the words spoken or printed represented to society a clear and present danger. Justice Oliver Holmes famously compared the leaflets to falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, highlighting that speech, which is both false and dangerous, is not protected.
While it seemed logical enough, the clear and present danger test would only last until 1969, when the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio would establish a new test to protect a broader range of speech. Brandenburg was a KKK leader in Ohio who was involved in a rally of speeches referring revengeance on particular ethnic groups and potential plans for a march on Washington. He was charged with advocating violence. However, the Supreme Court reversed the decision on the basis that Brandenburg was convicted for merely advocating violence, which is too abstract to be punished. In determining this, the Supreme Court established the imminent lawless action test for defining the limits of free speech. Under this test, the speech is not protected by the First Amendment if the speaker intends to incite a violation of the law that is both imminent and likely. The advocacy of force or criminal activity does not receive First Amendment protections if 1. The advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and 2. If likely to incite or produce such action. Threatening speech was expanded upon further in the same year with the establishment of the True Threat Doctrine, stemming from the case of Watts versus the United States. Watts was convicted in a Washington, D.C. district court for violating a statute prohibiting persons from knowingly and willfully making threats to harm or kill the President of the United States. Upon review, the court ruled that Watts had made a comment in jest and thus determined that he was stating his opposition to the President in an offensive manner rather than in a threatening manner. In order for speech to be considered a true threat, it must be viewed in its context.
And the amendments themselves were made to make the society a better place, and making sure that hate speech is not allowed would make the society better.
The current amount of regulation that we have isn't doing what it's supposed to, so there should be more stringent regulations than what we have now on what you can say, when you can say it, and why saying it in a certain context matters more than saying it out of that context.
I think that, freedom of the press is great, but if you shout fire in a crowded movie theater, it doesn't, there are consequences to that. I mean, if you call somebody, a racial slur, it should, of course, be regulated.
Especially in case of free speech and the amendment right that we have, a lot of individuals see it as an infringement on that right. Another complexity with it has to do with who and what can say what is hate speech and what is not. For instance, somebody's opinion could be hate speech to someone else, but not to that actual person.